When I bring the staff out to a farm, I don't tell them whether it's regenerative, but I can listen to them, and the amount of laughter on a regenerative farm is a lot more, and we get more work done on a regenerative farm. And if I had them spit in a cup, I think their cortisol levels would be lower on that regenerative farm, the stress hormones, right? So yeah, physiologically, we know what a good farming system is. But boy, when we disconnect ourselves and we forget that spirituality almost, or what maybe we interpret our senses as giving us as spirituality, then that's to our detriment.
That's scientist and farmer Jonathan Lundgren. He's our guest on today's podcast. You're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast, a co-production of the Radio Cafe and Quivira Coalition. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. We'll be back with Dr. Lundgren right after this quick announcement. Quivira's new agrarian program is accepting applications for the 2025 season until December 15th. Apprenticeships take place on working ranches and farms practicing regenerative agriculture across the Intermountain West. These 8-month full-time paid apprenticeships include housing and will allow apprentices to be fully immersed in the work of an operation. Program support includes in-person gatherings, an education stipend, educational Zoom calls, one-on-one check-ins, and networking opportunities to kickstart a career in regenerative agriculture. Apprenticeships begin in March, April, and run through November. You can learn more at quiviracoalition.org/newagrarian. And now to our program. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's guest, Jonathan Lundgren. He's an entomologist, agroecologist, farmer, rancher, and beekeeper. He's founder and director of the Ecdysis Foundation and CEO of Blue Dasher Farm. We'll be talking about both of those today. And I've been aware of his work for some years. I saw him featured in the series Roots So Deep by Peter Bick, whom we had on this podcast a few months back. He spoke at the Regenerate conference last month, and he just seems like one of those rare people who's both kind of a heavy hitter scientist in his field and at the same time so literally down to earth, being a farmer and working so closely with farmers. Welcome, Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, to Down to Earth.
It's great to be here.
So before we start talking about the work that you're doing, I'd love to hear your story if you're open to that. Like, how did you first get interested in insects?
Oh, geez. As a kid, I was always a biologist. So I loved animals. And so I knew I would have a career in animals. I used to manage a pet shop as a teenager, and I worked at the Minnesota Zoo for many years, and Lake Superior Zoo up in Duluth. And then I took a college class, an intro, the Bugs for Thugs class. And I decided right then and there I was going to be an entomologist. That was going to be the area of biology that I would specialize on.
And so you went on with that and you got your PhD, and then you worked for the USDA. What were you doing there? And how did that open the path, if it did, to regenerative agriculture?
So I was a research scientist with USDA. I was hired to be a soybean entomologist in eastern South Dakota. And with the way we like to partition our food system or, categorize everything, it kind of limits us from solving any issues. And so the soybean aphid problem was never a entomology problem. It was always a soil problem. So there was really no chance for success from a research standpoint or a problem-solving standpoint within that framework. But, I was a good scientist. I did things right. I saw the goals. And when you have a set of metrics of success that you can focus on, then, I've always been good at making formulas for succeeding within that context. But then things weren't changing, right? It wasn't getting better. Things like I could drive from my house in South Dakota over to Minnesota and rural communities were still disappearing, right? Climates were changing, pollution's rampant, people are sick. And it's just kind of like, the science I was doing wasn't, if I was supposed to be helping farmers, how's it working, right? So, When I asked the wrong questions and as far as starting to look a little deeper into pesticide risk assessments and then also this regenerative movement kind of started to come out of nowhere and it seemed like there was a lot of promise there. And yeah, those weren't popular things to work on within the USDA, so yeah, ultimately I ended up quitting and started something different. I just kind of thought, if we want to use science to help the evolution of our food system, then science is going to have to evolve too, at least how we use it.
Well, I mean, this is what you said was so interesting is you realize it wasn't a bug problem, it was a soil problem. Explain that and how you came to that realization.
Well, I don't know that I entirely understood it at the time because I was laser focused on those metrics of success of getting publications and grants and things. And you can do that pretty easily by focusing on your area of specialization. But, it wasn't solving the soybean aphid problem, right? Now I understand that soil and the plant's interaction with it insects are never the problem, right? They are always a symptom. And the soil oftentimes, and a lack of biodiversity usually from a habitat, is ultimately kind of what drives pest problems. And we had done that work at USDA and kind of started to figure that out. But yeah, when it starts to get into system change, well, that's not something that was as welcome.
For those of our listeners who aren't farmers, explain how biodiversity and soil really are the issue here, because I think it's important. I mean, somebody's got aphids, somebody's got these pests that are eating their crops or their plants or whatever. What is the role of biodiversity in taking the pressure off of the things that they're trying to grow and eat?
Yeah, right on. So soil is alive. It has the physical and chemical properties necessary for supporting plants and additional life within that system. But the biology is also essential. So all of the living microorganisms and invertebrates and other critters that live in that soil end up driving its productivity. So typically, like a prairie where most row crops in the United States are grown, there's hundreds of plant species that exist within that habitat. And if we eliminate that biodiversity, then, that biodiversity used to do a lot of things. It used to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and use that, turn it into organic matter in order to feed the next generation of plants and so on. And so when you eliminate a lot of that biodiversity, you have to replace the productivity of the landscape using artificial means, jugs, pesticides, fertilizers, and things along those lines. And ultimately, those monocrops tend to be very sick. I mean, yeah, they're selectively bred to be highly productive of large seeds that, we can force feed into our animals, but plants didn't evolve within that context. They evolved within communities. And so restoring those communities and ecosystem function that accompanies that, well, that's the solution to a lot of problems.
I mean, when you say that, I can't help but make the analogy to us. I mean, we evolved within communities, and there's a kind of like ethic of individualism and self-sufficiency that isn't really adaptive.
No, it's not. And that gets down to even a more fundamental level is, practically humans are simply walking sacks of microbes. There's more microbial species or cells in our bodies than there is somatic human cells, which kind of, so it extends beyond just communities of humans. We have to be connected to the natural world.
So how do you define regenerative agriculture? That's something that you talked a little bit about at the Regenerate conference.
Yeah. Well, I think fundamentally, what is a regenerative farm and what does that look like, I guess? Regenerative agriculture connects humans with the natural world, with families and with communities, and that's essential. Okay, so if we wanted to haul out the buckets of practices that oftentimes accompany that definition of, no-till, never leave bare soil, perenniality in livestock, integration, elimination of synthetic fertilizers and chemicals, management of that livestock in a holistic manner. We can do that, right? We can haul those things out. And that even gives opportunities to stamp it, right? Stamp it with regenerative and whatever label scheme that seems to be evolving right now. But if that label doesn't reflect or promote, if you somehow attain it without fundamentally growing food for your family and your community and having human feet touch every acre of your farm and that celebration of life, then we're not going to attain what's possible within our food system or within a regenerative food system.
I get asked that a lot by people who say, "Oh, what's your podcast about? Regenerative agriculture. Oh, what's that?" And I've been trying for years to figure out what's the right thing to say, and the latest thing that I've come to is leaving the land better off than you found it.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
It's like the Boy Scouts, leave the campsite better than you found it.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, isn't it?
Well, one of the things that you talk about is this idea that we can improve land health and human health at the same time. Those things aren't at odds with each other. And that involves this kind of reversing this trend of simplifying or oversimplifying agriculture. Talk about that. What does that mean? What got simple that shouldn't?
Yeah. Simplification of landscapes happened when we broke the prairie and tilled up the soil, and we deforested areas of the planet that shouldn't be, and then replaced it with a monoculture of crops or livestock, as the case may be. And that simplification, just like I was saying, led to the dependence on jugs, on different chemicals. But, even in biological systems, the exploitation of resources by an organism is pretty typical to a point. And so we're almost experiencing this late succession capitalism that's affected our food system, and it can't go on much longer because the mind's empty, right? And so...
Yeah, like the extraction, eventually you extract everything there is to extract.
Yeah, it is. That's not farming, is it? That's mining.
So what are we mining?
The natural resources, our own humanity. I think really we've lost our sight of who it is that we are and how we need to be connected with the natural world around us with respect and humility. We thought we just got so smart, didn't we, that we could replace it with technology, and technology can be used to help, but if it's used to replace the natural world or the biological system, man, that leads to complacency and ultimately failure.
It's funny, like this, there's the kind of chemical simplification. It's like you kill all the life in the soil and you replace it with NPK, your simple things, and you replace it with, as you say, jugs of pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides and all those kinds of things. And on the other hand, there's a kind of like over-complexifying of it that, to my mind, and I don't know if this is right, but it seems like, you could graze animals on the prairie, or you could grow soybeans and corn and then ship the animals off to buildings and then ship the soybeans and corn into the buildings. And then, it just seems like we make those things so much more complicated than they need to be.
Yeah, with cheap energy, though, that consolidation is cost effective and efficient, right? You can move a lot more animals through that way, and you don't, and the middlemen don't have to depend on individual farmers quite so heavily anymore, right? And so the supply chain ends up functioning, but it doesn't work forever. It doesn't work for long, in fact, and we're seeing the breakdown of that now.
You founded the Ecdysis Foundation. First of all, what does ecdysis mean?
Shedding the old skin. It's a geeky entomology term for metamorphosis.
Which is like a metaphor for what we're doing in agriculture?
It's a metaphor for, I think, so many things. For me personally, it was my own metaphor, a metaphor that described my own arc of my scientific and personal lives. It's a metaphor for what's happening with regenerative ag and the rebirth of agriculture. So yeah, I thought it was pretty fitting, and it's bugs, so that makes it fun too. So.
I mean, I'm asking you that because I didn't know what the word meant, and I looked it up, and on one of those pages there, you can find all these pictures, all these like little mini videos of these bugs shedding their skin, and it's so cool. And on some level, it's like, yeah, I know what that feels like metaphorically. I mean, we don't shed our own exoskeletons, but we do shed parts of our lives. What does the foundation do?
Yeah, 1,000 Farms Initiative is what we do. So we're a 501c3. We're kind of trying to rethink how science is applied in agriculture in order to help to support the evolution of a regenerative food system. So yeah, it's housed on an operating regenerative farm in South Dakota. The scientific staff all helps on the farm, and that changes the questions that we ask, and it changes how we ask them. That connection with the problem that we're facing.
I mean, let's talk about the science. I was reading your blog on your website. You wrote about a scientific gathering that you went to recently, and you wrote, quote, "I met the World Authority scientists at the meeting. They were friendly, but they made it clear that I wasn't one of them." And I thought that was so interesting because you write about a new vision of agricultural science. What's the current mainstream vision in science? I mean, sometimes even regenerative ag science. And what's the difference between that and the way you're doing science?
I think it's the metrics of success that really separates what we're doing at Ecdysis from anything else that's out there. And that's not to say that there aren't great scientists within, the normal scientific infrastructure, right? It's just the institutions at large have kind of lost their sense of identity. They've become swollen bureaucracies that try to keep as many people happy as they can, so therefore nobody's happy. And scientists within that space, I mean, they're only hired and promoted if they adhere to that bureaucracy, if they publish scientific journal articles, if they get the money, right? If they get those grants funded. And so science kind of has gotten into this sort of self-perpetuating rut. And it's really hard to break out of that without getting out of that current system. I tried to change the USDA from within, right? And that's a really hard row to hoe. So,
no pun intended.
Yeah. So, when we started Ecdysis and Blue Dasher as our farm, yeah, we changed the metrics of success to, relationships that we fostered with farmers across the United States. The peer-reviewed science is still important. Don't get us wrong about that. Our science is second to none. I mean, every year we have like a paper that comes out that's in the top 1% of all science ever written in terms of social media impact. But its acres changed, its lives touched, as opposed to grant dollars and grad students pumped through the puppy mill and publications and committees served on. So,
what does that look like in real life? I mean, like, what are you studying? What are you measuring?
So with 1,000 Farms, we're measuring a continent's food system on an intimate level. So it may not be the biggest, but it's awfully big. The larger or largest scientific studies, certainly of regenerative ag, that's ever been done. We deploy scientific teams out to individual farms across North America, about 1,284 of them so far over the last 3 years. We meet the farmers, we talk to them, we listen to them, we measure their soils. We measure the water. We measure the life on their farm. We measure the nutrient density, the economics, the social, mental, physical wellness, and behavior of these farmers. Thinking about it from a systems perspective. and then we give all the data away for free. So it's a different model.
Yeah. When you say you measure the life on the farm, I mean, that's a lot of things. That can be everything from, soil microbial life to farm animals to crops to weeds, so-called weeds, to other kind of plant life to wildlife. I mean, it's like there's life embraces everything. Like, are you measuring all that stuff?
We've identified about at least 10,000 species from our nation's food system so far. It's the largest bioinventory that I've ever seen. I think we've got, just 10,000 bacterial and fungal species that we've identified from the soil. We look at invertebrates. I think we've identified about 1.3 million specimens and developed an artificial intelligence program in order to do that. We've quantified birds and plants. We're putting ecoacoustic sensors out into each farm. So yeah, we're measuring all of that. And nobody's really ever tried to do that before. But honestly, I mean, that's fundamentally what should have been measured all along, right? It should have been incentivized all along. When we look at carbon or water or some of these other things, those are outcomes, right? Those aren't what the farmer is manipulating necessarily. Sure, they're turning their spigots off sometimes, but yeah, life is what they're manipulating on their farms. And if they do it right, the carbon takes care of itself.
Meaning that a lot of carbon gets stored in the soil.
Right. Yeah. And we found that, right? We found that regenerative soils, just in row crops alone, if we were to devote the nation's row cropping systems over to fully regenerative production practices, it would store 12 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents while growing life and improving the resilience of the farm and all of these other outcomes that are really important. So, I mean, when you think about that, the relative contributions of various climate mitigation strategies, I mean, they're looking at a gigaton. We've got 12, right? Just associated with our food system. And that's just row crops. I mean, when you start digging into livestock systems or orchard systems, the best row cropping system in terms of carbon storage is equivalent to, I mean, probably the worst livestock system or rather pasture system, I should say, or perennial system. So if we really wanted to get serious about mitigating climate change with our food system, we wouldn't grow row crops.
But I mean, that number, that 12 gigaton, that is more than our annual emissions.
Right. It's about twice the emissions, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which means that this is a climate change reversal strategy.
Well, depending on how fast that carbon gets put into the soil and how stable it is and what the emissions are in these different systems, yeah, I think it's the best option I've seen.
I think it's so interesting. One thing I've noticed doing this show, and I've been having a conversation with a scientist about this who's working in regenerative agriculture, and that is that the people like you who are both farmers and scientists who are engaged in regenerative agriculture, who are doing these calculations, the calculations basically say that there's a lot more carbon that can be drawn down into the soil than scientists who are working in universities and institutions who are not themselves farmers. I mean, this is I don't know if you've seen this, but this is a pattern I've seen. So you got one group of people who have maybe more academic credentials and therefore are more often quoted by journalists and so on, saying, yeah, we could maybe draw down 30% of the carbon in the atmosphere. And then you're saying we could draw down 200% of these same emissions. How do you understand that?
There's a lot of armchair ecologists that are making global food policy decisions right now. That's a real problem. You know, scientists used to go out into the field. They used to observe the natural world, and they use those observations to generate hypotheses. And nowadays, that really doesn't happen as often as it needs to. In fact, it's pretty rare for most scientists to go out into the field anymore. they're sitting behind their desk trying to come up with a new sexy grant proposal, and the graduate students go out to the field for a while and until they reach their threshold of prominence.
And this is USDA and agricultural scientists you're talking about?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So this is all university and USDA scientists I mean, again, that's painting with a broad brush, but I mean, I think I'm right.
I mean, this is like a paradigm shift that you're talking about, which is going from science that is deeply involved in a kind of bureaucratic institutionalism to science that is in service of the farmers and done by farmers and allows the voices of farmers. It's a really big change that you are, trying to and involved in really doing.
I think so. I mean, the realization that, scientists were never meant to be the experts on farming, I mean, that's step one. That's pretty humbling, right? You spend your entire career and a decade in higher education to be an expert at something. The reality is that scientists were always meant to be servants. They weren't meant to be experts at farming. The farmers are the experts at farming, and they're developing successful systems. Regenerative ag is a perfect example of that. Science has a role to play there. Scaling it, transferring it, understanding why and why not it might work. But the deference towards science or scientific expertise, thinking that somehow replaced the expertise of farming or whatever other facet of society that scientists are meant to serve, that's the wrong direction. We need to recognize our place.
You just mentioned scaling and that, science has a role to play in that. And I feel like part of the problem of conventional agriculture today is scale, in the sense that there are these massive monocrop operations that are terrible for soil and water. You visited so many farms in your 1,000 Farm Initiative. It's more than 1,000 now, as you said. Is there, I know this is kind of general question, but is there a maximum size for a regenerative farm that keeps it manageable for stewardship of biodiversity and that real set of relationships between people and food that you are promoting?
Well, one of our central conclusions from 1,000 Farms is that we need a lot more farmers, and they need to be farming smaller and better, not bigger and simpler. And so how big is too big? I can envision business models, right, where food production is happening and there's managers of particular, food crops that are keeping tabs on that, and they're able to connect with that land and human feet touching every acre, all those wonderful aspects. But, ideally, what a regenerative food system is going to look like is a lot more farmers. They're going to be farming 10 acres or less for their communities and their families and getting that food where it needs to go. I was talking with some farmers down in Nebraska not long ago, and they were getting some soil hubs up and running, and they were going to, compare irrigated versus no irrigation, and they wanted us to come in and study it on corn. And I'm like, I'm not really interested in that. I just don't think cash grain production at that scale is really the answer. And they asked what the future of food looks like in Nebraska. I'm like, 15 years, 85% of farmland is going to be pastures and rangelands in Nebraska. The other 15% is going to grow food for humans, not animals. That's a huge shift, right? That's a huge shift.
What do you think pushes that shift?
I think Crisis does a pretty good job of that. I think cash grain production has been dead for a long time and didn't know it. It's been on chemotherapy and HMOs for way too long. So getting them off of that would help.
When you talk about, lots of farms of 10 acres, I mean, that makes sense for local food production, but we live in a country of institutions that need, it's not just like you and me going to the farmer's market and buying food. I mean, it's schools and hospitals and senior centers and airplanes and restaurants and all of these things that aren't going anywhere. I mean, they might take a hit, but these are something that we have to contend with. How do you think about all of that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's going to be a necessary dispersion of the human population that may already be happening since COVID. There's a lot of communities that are getting swollen with folks from the coasts at this point, in my neck of the woods at least. That doesn't eliminate cities, right? But, I think there's going to have to be a cultural shift that ends up happening. And what that looks like, I don't know that we're entirely going to be able to predict that, but knowing your farmer, growing food yourselves for your own families, that's a huge first step in this whole process. Connecting our kids with food production and what that looks like, that's huge. So that's not a great answer to your question, but I think that this is the trajectory that it's going to end up looking like, but how we get there is a great question. One of the problems that we've seen time and again as we've visited almost every single food system that we've visited so far, farmers are good at growing food. They're not always good at marketing. That's not their skill set, so that's not what they like to do. And so in comes this middleman, right? This broker, this aggregator, and that company looks really great at first. But every year the margins for the farmer ends up going a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. And the prices for the consumer goes up, and the people in the middle do just fine. And so it becomes this exploitative. Is it necessary for it to be so? No, it doesn't have to be that way. But we're going to have to get away from this greed that has become so pervasive in agriculture and maybe even within human society at large.
I mean, in the example that you just gave, if you have an aggregator that comes in and does the marketing and becomes the middleman, that seems like a good idea on a regional scale, as long as those people can not require 5 to 15% growth every year in terms of their own profit, if that has to come out of the pocket of the farmer.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes that's driven by external factors, and sometimes that's driven just by their own greed.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to my husband the other day, and he said, we've been farming on Earth for at least 10,000 years or more, and communities have adapted to farming to survive. And there's probably a sense that at this point has been hardwired into us about what good farming is. I mean, we feel it, we smell it and taste it. And conversely, we know intuitively what bad farming is. And it seems like it would just take so much like advertising and policy and almost indoctrination to get us to do and continue doing bad farming. That, like when he said that felt right to me. I mean, neither of us is farmers, but we garden. But I mean, I don't know how that feels to you, but I just keep wondering why is it not screamingly obvious to everyone that regenerative ag is the only way to go forward?
There's a couple of things that have happened. The degradation of family structure has become a real problem. A lot of farming right now is dominated by men and oftentimes white men. And that has led us down to this perception that efficiency is the best, right? And not to say that other elements of society or demographics don't also appreciate that efficiency, but rather there's different currencies that seem to be at play, that when you involve a family in all of its diversity of decision-making, then suddenly things are just different, right? So Blue Dasher is a great example of this, okay? I'm out here when I got started, I was alone and I was, hyper focused on, okay, let's get shit done, right? Get that fence in, boom, boom, boom. Get the animals fed in the morning. I can get morning chores done in about 45 minutes. And then Christina comes in and it takes her 2-3 hours to do this. And I'm like, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm watching the animals eat. I'm like, what? Why would you waste your time on that? But we had the best lambing rate we've ever had because she knows what's going on with them. And it was like, I really needed that. I didn't understand how much I needed that, and the farm needs that. And now we're growing flowers everywhere. And I'm like, man, this is a hyper diverse farm. We've got all kinds of things to feed our bees. Boom, boom, boom. We're going to get the honey crop off. And now we're growing flowers. She's a cut flower person too. So we sell that at the farmer's market. I've never seen so much life since we started to introduce some of these things. And so sometimes logic and efficiency and economic currencies aren't the best important thing. And incorporating that and allowing those other elements of what's being human back into our lives is really, really important. And I said all of that stuff, and I don't even remember why I got started down this rabbit hole, but yeah.
Well, I was saying the thing about we have like an intuitive sense of what good farming is. I don't know. Do you feel that way?
I think physiologically we do, right? We know it. Our senses, when I bring the staff out to a farm, I don't tell them whether it's regenerative, but I can listen to them. And the amount of laughter on a regenerative farm is a lot more. And we get more work done on a regenerative farm. And if I had them spit in a cup, I think their cortisol levels would be lower on that regenerative farm, the stress hormones, right? So yeah, physiologically, we know what a good farming system is. But boy, when we disconnect ourselves and we forget that spirituality almost, or what maybe we interpret our senses as giving us as spirituality, then that's to our detriment.
And it's so interesting because these are the things that are, the amount of laughter or the way you feel in your heart when you're on a farm that's working well. Those are things you can't really write up in a paper.
No, and that's one of the hardest parts of my job, right? Because the data often says, these farmers are doing things that science says can't happen in a lot of cases. But
like what?
Like growing organic matter in soil at a rate that science says takes 50 years. They're doing it in a year or two. Increasing biodiversity of rare and threatened species on their farm, increasing the resilience of their operations, and yeah, on and on. What I do when I'm looking at the plants on the farm as far as what the sheep are going to, I look at the university recommendations of things not to feed the sheep, because they're toxic and poisonous to the sheep. Those are the plants my sheep eat first. They like those things. But their gut microbiome is totally different than the one that from a feedlot where they, fed them choke cherries and watched them choke, right? Our sheep love those things. So this is changing the rules of the game. I can look at that data and I'm like, I've been to these farms. I've felt them with all of my senses, and I can't deny what it is that I've experienced when I visit these farms. And so as a scientist, it's my job to make sure that the data that I'm collecting is a reflection of something that my spirit is experiencing. And if I get that wrong, that's a huge responsibility, right? Because if I get it wrong, then we're not going to know what our food system is capable of.
One of the things that is part of the whole regenerative ag paradigm is farmer well-being and rural community revitalization and things like that. What are you seeing in your 1,000+ farms in that respect?
Some of the most miserable farmers that we met are cash grain producers. They're locked in. Their metric of success was, did I buy the quarter next to me? And grandpa and dad were really successful, and now I've got a 2,000-acre farm, and what the hell am I supposed to do with it except grow cash grains? And if they don't do that and they let the farm fall, then their family's legacy is gone. And what a position to be in, huh? So every year they go down to the bank and they borrow $850,000 in order to make $50,000. Where's the other $800,000 going, right? And if they don't get it just right, even though the system's pretty darn dialed in, if they don't get it right, they let their families down. They're in debt beyond anything that them and their next generation can ever pay off. And so stress and mental health and physical health, because they're poisoning themselves at the same time with all the agrochemicals to keep that row cropping system going, it all falls apart, right? Women are one of the most important drivers of regenerative agriculture within families, I think. Oftentimes we'll see over this last year, it really became acute. A lot of conventional farmers, they feed their family organic. So they're not even eating the product. They won't feed their family the product that they're growing. There's some moral and ethical considerations there, but maybe that's the first step in the process of change.
Well, for example, these, you describe these miserable and highly in debt, land rich, cash poor, maybe you would say, grain farmers. Is there a path forward that some of them have taken toward regeneration that gets them on the road out of that situation?
Transferring crop ground at that scale over to pasture systems and rangeland systems. That's a huge shift, but I think that's what's going to end up having to happen. Stacking enterprises onto smaller acreages within, you don't have to farm every inch of your farm. A lot of those marginal areas aren't ever returning any financially to you. Let it be. Farm smaller and better.
Right. You were featured in Peter Bick's series, Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There. We did a nice podcast with him a while back. What was that experience like for you as a scientist trying to practice this new paradigm of science? Were you able to do it in that context?
Boy, that was like, God, I want to say 6 years ago. So it's funny.
Was it that long?
Yeah,
because it just came out not too long ago.
I know, and it took a little while for that to come out. So yeah. So I was at a much different stage of my life at that point. Yeah, it was, I thought, an exciting opportunity. And Peter did a great job with the film and telling that story, I think. Whether or not it planted a seed in terms of the 1,000 Farms initiative, I think it probably had some influence there. It was, 1,000 Farms is what that, in a lot of ways, that initial aggregation of scientists that ended up looking much different by the time the films were filmed, was intended to try to look at that at least at rangelands at scale. And it ended up being just 5 farms. So we did what we could as far as the entomology was concerned, and then moved on to something big.
Tell us more about Blue Dasher Farm. I mean, you've got this whole team there who are doing all kinds of cool stuff. You're in South Dakota, like eastern South Dakota. Tell us about the farming and the science that you're doing there. Yeah.
So the science that we're doing here, I mean, most of the science that we run is off on farms around North America, right? So we don't have, it's not like a research farm. We do have a laboratory facility here where we store an archive of the nation's soils, and we have a museum quality invertebrate collection and things like that. But the farm itself is an operating regenerative farm. We raise lamb, we raise honey, poultry, cut flowers. We have an orchard that's coming into fruit barrens now. So it's kind of this diversified farm. Half of the farm is native unbroken prairie. That's a real treasure, and wetlands. And we leave it that way. So yeah, I love it. It's a healing place.
Is it doing what we are all hoping for, which is making a living for the people who are there?
So Ecdysis and Blue Dasher are two sides of a coin, right? So Ecdysis doesn't function without Blue Dasher, and Blue Dasher doesn't function without Ecdysis. It's really a partnership there. I don't try to push Blue Dasher Farm into raising the funds in order to, I keep it in the black, and then it's poised that if we ever needed it to be our primary income source, we could certainly do that with no trouble. I could easily generate my current salary off of the farm without any additional even labor, really, just Christina and I and the family. So it's a little bit of a weird situation, but yeah, it is an operating farm. It's meant to grow food for our family and for our community. It is also a training ground for the next generation of scientists.
And the scientists are there through the Ecdysis Foundation.
Correct, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, very interesting. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to tell people about?
Oh, what the future it looks like. 1,000 Farms has been going for 3 years now, and we cleared 1,000 farms. And so a lot of people are kind of like, all right, you did it, John. Ready to close up shop? And I'm like, well, actually, we're kind of in the thick of it right now. We got probably 3 years left, and our hope is to focus for the next 3 years. The original 1,000 Farms has documented where we've been and where we are. I want to focus the last 3 years on the future of farming and finding those farmers that are doing that, putting data behind it now so that we know what we can expect as this food system evolves towards those. Things like no-till organic vegetable production, things like conversion of croplands over to rangeland systems, things like silvopasture, heritage grains, things that are kind of perenniality in as many forms as we can, pastured livestock systems as opposed to CAFOs. That's where we're going to be doubling down over the next 3 years, and we're pretty excited about that.
And for that to happen, there's things that drive change, and one of them, as you said, is crisis and catastrophe and unsustainability of the system as it is. And we seem to be careening toward that in lots of different ways. And then another one is policy. Are you working on the policy piece to try to drive change in that way?
Certainly we have discussions with decision makers. We provide primary data so that global food policies can be created. Just like I can't force a farmer to change, I can't force a policymaker to acknowledge that this is the future. So we are there when they need it.
Jonathan Lundgren, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks for giving this time and spread the word.
You can find out more about Dr. Jonathan Lundgren's work at ecdysis.bio, ecdysis.bio. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.